My life took a significant turn one April morning as the petals of flowers fluttered in the air. Jane Hanson is my name. I was enjoying my 20th birthday on that particular day. There ought to have been a lot of lively festivities. However, my daughter Emma's sobs started my morning. In the bed beside Emma, who was just a year old, had woken up with a milk thirst. I sprang to my feet and grabbed her up. I always had the will to live because of the warmth emanating from her little frame. It was the sensation of her smooth skin, the lovely smell of infants. It was the reason I was here. I murmured quietly, "Good morning, Emma," and gave her a gentle head kiss. She had the same velvety black hair as myself, but there's no question that her father gave her those soft brown eyes. I occasionally felt hurt by those eyes, but Emma's naive grin made even that hurt feel priceless. I've made an effort to put Emma's father out of my mind. Every time I think about him, my chest feels constricted. He vanished as soon as he found out I was pregnant. He removed his social media profiles and updated his contact details. He seemed to want his entire life to be erased. I remember the last day I saw him. His expression as we sat across from each other in a cafe still lingers in my mind. The color drained from his face when I told him I was pregnant, followed by the seemingly eternal silence after. He said he needed some time and left. Back then, I was 18 years old, a high school student about to enter university. My life was full of dreams and hopes for the future. The world seemed filled with possibilities. I was set to study literature and dreamed of becoming a writer. On weekends, I would go to the movies with friends, and on weekdays, I'd immerse myself in books at the library. I was just an ordinary high school girl. When I discovered I was pregnant, everything changed. My parents' reaction was as expected, or perhaps even more intense than I had thought. "Shameful! You have tarnished our family's reputation." My mother's words still echo in my ears. I remember the heavy atmosphere in the living room at dusk that day. My father's deep sighs and my mother's trembling voice filled the silence. My mother repeated the same words over and over while crying, as if trying to convince herself. How could this happen? Her voice was as cold as an autumn night's breeze. On the other hand, my sister Elisa was different. She was 16 at the time, bright and lively. She was my parents' favorite, captain of the cheerleading team, and an excellent student. She was the daughter my parents always wanted. She didn't say much about my pregnancy. She just occasionally looked at me with sympathetic eyes. In her gaze, there was a mix of pity and a sense of relief, as if to say, "I am different." In the 2 years since I had Emma, I had been desperate. I attended community college during the day and worked at a store at night. I cut back on sleep to study, and somehow managed to obtain a childcare qualification. During this time, my mother mostly took care of Emma. When I returned from my night shifts, my mother would be holding Emma, looking exhausted. Sometimes, I saw her gently singing lullabies. During those moments, I could feel the love in her. However, my mother's kindness always had thorns. While caring for Emma, she never held back her critical words. "This happened because you were reckless," she would say as she changed Emma's diaper. Her hands were gentle, but her words were sharply piercing. "Do you realize the trouble you're causing us?" She would sigh as she warmed up the milk. That sigh weighed heavily on my heart. If only you could have been more like Alyssa. After putting Emma to bed, my mother would often mutter those words. They seeped into my heart like a curse. I heard such words almost daily. In my room, I would often cry while holding Emma, listening to her soft breathing. I wished to provide her with a better environment. However, that wish always crashed against the walls of reality. Economic independence still seemed like a distant dream. One morning, After finishing feeding Emma her milk, I heard my mother's voice from downstairs. "Jane, it's time for breakfast." There was an unusual tension in her voice, a strange sound mixed with anticipation and anxiety. I carried Emma downstairs. In the living room, my parents awaited me with grave expressions. There was no breakfast on the table. Instead, a few documents were laid out. "Sit down." My father's voice resonated unusually low. I did as instructed and sat on the sofa, holding Emma on my lap. Perhaps sensing the tense atmosphere, she was quieter than usual. "Jane, we need to talk," my mother began, her hands trembling slightly. "It's about Alyssa." At that moment, my heart leaped. The crying from Alyssa's room last night, the excited voices of my parents that lasted into the night, the sounds of footsteps back and forth in the hallway, all made me think something significant had happened. Time seemed to slow down as I waited for my mother's next words. "Alyssa is pregnant." I choked. My sister was only 18, and she got pregnant at the same age I had. The coincidence seemed like a cruel twist of fate. Who is the father? My question almost whispered out. The already heavy air in the room seemed to thicken. "It's Chris, the son of the real estate company president," my mother replied, her voice carrying a hint of pride. This change in her tone caused a sharp pain in my heart. Chris Baker, the only son of a well-known wealthy family in the area. His father's real estate business was one of the most successful enterprises in the region. I had heard that Alyssa started dating him in high school. I had met him at the school's cultural festival. He was a tall, smart-looking young man. The way he held Alyssa by the waist and proudly looked at her, they indeed made a picture-perfect couple. At the time, I was genuinely happy for my sister's happiness. But now, that memory brought up complex emotions. My father cleared his throat. "We've made a decision." I had no idea then that this decision would change the fate of Emma and me. "Alyssa and the baby will live here. Chris will join them." This statement felt odd. Although there were indeed 4 rooms in this house, all were currently in use. My parents' bedroom, Alyssa's room, the room for Emma and me, and a former guest room used as storage. "And so, Jane," my father's voice was heavy, "I'm sorry, but I need you and Emma to leave." A loud noise seemed to ring overhead, and for a moment, everything appeared white, a ringing in my ears, and the room's atmosphere felt as if it had frozen. "What?" My voice trembled weakly. Emma looked up at me anxiously, her small hand gripping my sweater tightly. "She's giving birth to a boy, our grandson," my mother said excitedly. There was a heat in her voice that I had never heard before. "He will continue the family line. He must be raised in the proper environment." My mother's eyes shone unnaturally bright. I could vividly imagine my parents' reaction when they learned Alyssa's baby was a boy. "But Emma is a girl," my mother stated coldly. There was no trace of kindness in her voice. "Besides, you are an unmarried mother. It affects our reputation." At that moment, everything became clear. To my parents, Emma and I had always been a disgrace. In contrast, Alyssa's pregnancy was a blessing because the father came from a wealthy family and the child to be born was a boy. Emma coughed softly. That sound snapped me back to reality. I had to protect this child. I had to secure her future. "How soon do we need to leave?" My voice was surprisingly calm. "Today," my father answered. "Chris is moving in tomorrow." It felt like a nightmare, yet it was reality. "Okay." I stood up and embraced Emma. She, unaware of the situation, smiled innocently. That smile nearly tore my heart into pieces, but I couldn't cry in front of her. That morning, I frantically packed our belongings. As I stuffed the essentials into cardboard boxes, tears streamed down my face. Yet, these were not merely tears of sadness. They contained anger, disappointment, and, strangely, a sense of liberation. Living in this house, always mindful of others' eyes, those days were now ending. Though the reality was frightening, it also marked a new beginning. Alyssa remained shut in her room. Occasionally, I could hear her crying through the door. The sound of crying seemed to contain complex emotions. Was it guilt, regret, or just hormonal changes due to her pregnancy? I couldn't comprehend my sister's heart. Was she suffering from this situation or just stressed from the pregnancy? Inside me, sisterly love clashed fiercely with the feelings of betrayal. In the afternoon, I called my father's sister, my Aunt Susan. My heart pounded as the phone rang. She had always been my ally. Every Christmas, she knitted handmade sweaters for me and never missed sending a handwritten letter on my birthday. She's a truly warm person. "What?" My aunt raised her voice in anger over the phone. It carried shock, anger, and deep sadness. "Are those two sane, Aunt?" I stuttered. She quickly replied without hesitation, "Come to my house right away. There is always a room ready for you and Emma." Her words made me tear up again, this time with relief. Warm tears streamed down my cheeks. For the first time, I felt a glimpse of hope. On the other side of the phone, my aunt continued, "I'm coming to get you right now with my car. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Just pack what you need." Her voice lacked its usual calmness, replaced by a resolute strength. "But the luggage, don't worry. We can come back for it later. Right now, your and Emma's safety is the priority." After hanging up, I took a deep breath. By evening, I had loaded the last of our belongings into the car. My parents saw us off with a gaze as if they were looking at strangers. They stood at the doorstep, their eyes seemingly empty. My mother opened her mouth several times, but ultimately said nothing. Her expression seemed to carry a tinge of regret, although it could have been my imagination. My father crossed his arms and watched us leave with the demeanor of someone seeing off a contractor, avoiding eye contact. "Goodbye," I said. At my words, they just nodded silently. Emma sat in the back seat of my aunt's car, clutching a new stuffed animal she had bought along the way. "You need new friends for a new beginning," my aunt said kindly. At that kindness, I nearly choked up. On the way to my aunt's house, I pulled out my smartphone, trembling, and opened the social media app. Years of pent-up thoughts burst forth in a flood of words, like a dam breaking and releasing all the emotions I had held back. Today, I was thrown out of my childhood home. The reason? My parents needed a room for their grandson. I have a 1-year-old daughter. Being an unmarried mother, I was always a disgrace to my family. Every day, I was confronted with this fact and forced to apologize as if my very existence was a mistake. However, the moment my sister became pregnant with the son of a wealthy family, everything changed. We were evicted for the sake of the heir to continue the family line, with just a day's notice. They didn't hesitate to kick out their own daughter and granddaughter. To those reading this post, know that such discrimination still exists in the 21st century. Parents who would kick out their own daughter and granddaughter because she is a girl and the mother is unmarried still exist. But this is not the end. It is a new beginning. Emma and I have a true family now. Blood does not always signify love, and I have learned what a real family is. And the moment I published the post, I felt a profound sense of release. I had unleashed all the emotions I had suppressed for so long to the world. At the same time, I felt a fierce anxiety. There was no turning back now. "Are you okay?" my aunt asked gently. Her voice was filled with deep understanding and support. "Yes," I nodded slightly. "I feel like I've finally been able to express my true feelings." Emma's cheerful laughter sounded from the back seat, giving me courage. We arrived at my aunt's house as the sun was setting. "You did well to come," my aunt said, embracing me and Emma tightly in her arms. I could feel the day's tension slowly melt away. Her body carried the familiar scent of soap, the smell of a safe place. "This is your new home now." Those words carried a definite weight. The house was remarkably tidy inside. My aunt must have prepared the room in anticipation of our arrival. In the corner of the living room, a small baby crib was already set up with clean sheets. The table was set with a warm dinner, its aroma filling the room. That night, I talked for a long time with my aunt. After Emma fell asleep, we sat around the kitchen table discussing everything: my parents' attitudes, Alyssa's pregnancy, and all my feelings up to now. Speaking aloud helped the fog inside my chest begin to take shape. "Your dad has always been bound by old traditions, but I never imagined it would go this far," my aunt said. Her voice mixed disappointment in her brother with deep affection for us. "Just because a boy is being born." My aunt shook her head. "To still hold such views in these times." And the next morning, my social media post had generated an unexpected amount of reaction. Notifications flooded the screen of my smartphone. Thousands of shares, tens of thousands of empathetic comments, and words of encouragement from strangers. Did I really do the right thing? I voiced my anxiety while preparing breakfast. It's become so big. "You did the right thing," my aunt said firmly. "Nothing changes unless someone speaks up." That afternoon, my grandfather called. "Jane, is it really true?" His voice trembled with anger. The usual calm was gone, replaced by intense emotion. "Yes," I replied quietly. "Everything is true." "I see." After a long silence, my grandfather spoke in a heavy voice. "Tomorrow your grandmother and I will come. Let us hear everything." The next day, my grandparents visited my aunt's house. As soon as he entered, my grandfather went straight to Emma. Initially wary, she quickly warmed up when he smiled gently at her. "Our wealth has been maintaining that house," he said while holding Emma on his lap. His voice carried a deep remorse. "And yet, they drive out their own daughter and granddaughter." My grandparents were wealthy. The house my parents lived in had actually been purchased with my grandfather's help, a fact I hadn't known until then. The large house, the well-maintained garden, all were supported by my grandfather. Perhaps our silence was to blame, my grandmother said quietly, tears glistening in her eyes. "We've spoiled them too much." "If they won't accept you," my grandfather stated firmly, Emma dozing off on his lap with her new stuffed animal, "the entire inheritance will go to you and Susan." Those words transformed the situation. His voice carried a resolute decision. This was not merely a threat, but a clear statement of intent. "Dad," my aunt choked up. "Susan, I trust you to use it correctly," my grandfather continued, "for Jane and Emma." My grandmother nodded silently. "It is difficult for us to make such a decision," my grandfather said gently, stroking Emma's hair. "But sometimes tough decisions are necessary." From that night on, calls from my parents were incessant. Initially, I ignored them, but gradually, the frequency increased. "Jane, let's talk." My mother's voice was more distraught than I had ever heard it before. "There's been a misunderstanding. We're family." After all, there was a clear desperation in her voice. They must have realized that my grandfather's decision would directly impact their lifestyle. "You just want the inheritance, don't you?" I said. A silence fell over the other end of the phone. That silence confirmed that my words had accurately hit their true intentions. I could hear my mother's breathing grow ragged over the phone. "Why would you say that?" Her voice trembled. "Because it's true, isn't it?" My voice remained surprisingly calm. When you threw me and Emma out, you didn't seem to have any qualms. I also received a message from Melissa. A long text from my sister appeared on the screen. Jane, I'm sorry. I didn't know anything. Our parents told me you wanted to leave on your own. The smartphone in my hand trembled slightly. Perhaps part of Alyssa's words were true. Maybe our parents hadn't told her the truth. However, that didn't excuse her indifference. I took a deep breath and slowly typed a response. Your son isn't to blame, but neither were Emma and I, yet you just watched in silence. There was no reply from Melissa after that. Suddenly, Emma jumped onto my lap. Her small hand touched my cheek. Her warmth brought me back to reality. A week later, the situation took an unexpected turn. Alyssa suddenly left our parents' house. A friend of my mother's from the neighborhood brought the news early in the morning. A large car parked in front of the house, and Alyssa's belongings were loaded into it. Our parents tried to stop her, but they were helpless. Chris's father was there to assist her. I've decided to live with Chris, Alyssa called me that afternoon. Her voice had a clarity I hadn't heard in a long time. What our parents are doing is wrong. I don't want to be part of it. Her words stirred complex feelings within me. Her decision was commendable, certainly requiring courage, but why hadn't she realized sooner? Why hadn't she spoken up when Emma and I were being driven out? Alyssa, my voice cracked a little. Why now? Jane, I've been thinking a lot since that day. I've had sleepless nights. Alyssa started sobbing over the phone. Chris's parents have accepted us. They don't care whether it's a boy or a girl. That's how it should be. A month later, as promised, my grandparents officially revised their will. The inheritance from my parents was removed, and instead, the rights were transferred to Aunt Susan and me. This news reached me via an angry call from my father. What have you done? His voice pierced through the phone. Are you planning to betray your family? Betray the family? I replied quietly, yet firmly. Who was it that drove out me and Emma? Without listening to my entire response, my father hung up the phone. In the following months, I worked hard to build a new life. I secured a job as a preschool teacher, and Emma started attending the daycare that my aunt managed. I struggled to balance work and childcare, but I no longer felt the loneliness I had before. M. Hansen, good morning. The children greeted me every morning with cheerful voices. Emma was among them. Initially, she had trouble distinguishing between teacher and mom, but now she cleverly uses both terms. Work was enjoyable, and my colleagues welcomed me warmly. Many had seen my social media post, but none showed any negative reactions. Many people supported me, saying, "It was brave of you to speak up. I don't have the courage you have, Jane." A veteran childcare worker, the head of the facility, remarked one day, "That courage can support someone else." Indeed, my social media post inspired many messages from others in similar situations. Some were young mothers who had also been driven out of their homes. I started communicating with them, and occasionally they sought advice. My experience might be serving as a guide for others. Emma quickly adapted to her new environment. My aunt's house has a small garden and she loves playing there. Her innocent smile whispers to my heart, "Your smile is my greatest treasure." Emma is turning 2. She is growing up surrounded by love in my aunt's home. We haven't been in contact with my parents. I exchange messages with Alyssa from time to time. She is desperately trying to rebuild her life. While I haven't fully forgiven her, she has acknowledged her mistakes and apologized. When Emma grows up, I plan to tell her this story, and I will say to her, "You have value regardless of your gender. You are irreplaceable." Now we are walking a new path in life. It is not an easy journey, but at least we are truly surrounded by family.